fall of the Berlin Wall and the Iron Curtain marked the end of the last geographic, political and economic barrier to the total expansion of free markets. Every nation in the world, except at the moment North Korea and the Island Museum of Cuba, has been seized by a process, sometimes dramatic and violent, of political, economic and social homologation. This process involves even countries apparently very distant, not only geographically but also culturally, like China, India and the entire Islamic world. China in particular, in spite of the fact that it is trying to preserve, although not for long, its totalitarian political structures, is launching itself, just like India, into a new process of economic globalization of surprising size and scope. Nevertheless, even while these nations are trying to become great economic powers, their roles are, and will be, at most, simply that of a privileged players in an international economic system which has no epicenter or commanding capital city, but instead has only an infinite number of fluctuating nodes, connected through a network of multinational corporations whose functional structures have no nucleus, no orbits, and no fixed geographical position. The social struggles for workers' rights in the 70s to tame massive Western European and American industrial complexes caused a crisis in Fordism, and consequently the destruction of the capitalist process of production based on the repetitive, divided labour of factory workers on their machines and assembly lines. From the 80s on, through the decentralisation and destructuring of production due especially to innovations in technology in the digital era, an economic form of interrelationships developed and materialised, which Marx defined in his Grundrisse entitled Foundations of the Critique of Political Economy as general intellect. Here Marx identified the prime movers in society as production and the accumulation of capital. Marx's law of value, still valid in factory settings, which states that the value of a product comes from the amount of time and labour required to create it, and which served as reference for the economic critique of Taylorism until the 70s, has today been surpassed by the new tendencies of capitalist development. Today we face a cognitive capitalism, i.e., an economic form which mainly and directly in the organisation of production employs a more flexible worker, one who can cross every area of expertise, both of society and of life in general. These employees can range from an information programmer to a philosopher, from a philosopher to a geologist, from a chemist to an historian, or from a sociologist to a pharmacist. It is often impossible to distinguish for production purposes between working life and private life. It is no longer a system of production in which one engineer supervises 1,000 workers on an assembly line. Now we have 1,000 engineers scattered around the world who all contribute to a system that is becoming ever more dependent on information technology, on science, on communication and on knowledge in general. This is a global economy today, whose foundations are, on the one hand, becoming increasingly dependent on intellectual labour, or intangible labour, while it, on the other hand, is still supported by extremely exploited labourers who do the hardest, most tiring jobs, the so-called live work or material work. China and India, due to their demographic, historical and cultural characteristics, possess a massive army of manual as well as intellectual labourers. This army of surplus labour can offer high output at very low cost, and it is, for now, prepared to offer its physical fatigue as well as its great intellectual creativity for a low salary and very few benefits. This is the secret behind these countries' unprecedented economic expansion, which, over the last 2 decades, has allowed them to approach the economic standards of the West. However, it is important to note this rise in economic power has not translated into better living rights or in working conditions similar to those enjoyed by workers in Western countries. Rights which were achieved only after 200 years of workers' struggles, 2 world wars, and an infinite number of strikes. We are therefore now facing a new phase in social development, the fight for a different existence. It is a fight for the first time in human history on a global scale. It is a struggle between the world of invisible power, hidden behind the multinational companies, driven to maximize pure venal profit, and the visible world, that of physical and intellectual labor, driven towards a better quality of life, with workers seeking to satisfy their needs for love, desire, creation, and ecology. 2 worlds set against each other. One, the biopower, linked to the interests of the economics of profit, and the other, the biopolitique, linked to the physical needs of the people and to their needs for diversity, heterogeneity, and identity. Depending on how the scales tip, this conflict will either result in a future of true democracy and freedom, or of hegemony and alienation. Globalization of the 21st century is fundamentally different from the colonialism and imperialism of the 20th century. Globalization is born out of workers' struggles in factories, from the rebellion against Soviet totalitarianism and from the anti-colonial wars. During the colonial period, from the beginning of the 20th century through the 60s and 70s, years distinguished by the so-called Cold War, capitalism felt comfortable with the borders of the nation-state. The state could control social conflict, basing its control on the social contract of the philosopher Thomas Hobbes, guaranteed private property, freedom relegated to state control in the face of a dog-eat-dog world, or homo homini lupus. In the process, the state could control the proliferation and accumulation of capital, where production is dependent on salaried workers, on factories, and on the tailorist organisation of work. Beyond national borders, capitalism responded to its thirst for profit with the